Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War news update video for the 14th of April 2023. Let's get to the usual starting place. The Ukraine official figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats, potentially inaccurate, propaganda. Russia don't produce the same kind of figures. I find these indicatively useful and give you an idea of the trends, what has happened the day before, and actually are probably more accurate these days than they are than critics give them critics give them credit for being. So 500 liquidated personnel, staying around where it has been for the last week, really. Nothing unusual there, but there has been some interesting stats in the equipment. 4 tanks, okay, 16 APCs. That's a really heavy number of APCs. I wonder what happened the night before, the day before, whether we have seen a hit on installation. I know there's a couple of HIMARS hits on places with equipment inside over the last few days. That could represent that, or just a bad day for mechanized equipment out in the field. 7 artillery systems, which is again a consistently decent number of artillery systems for the Ukrainians to take out. They are explicitly targeting artillery at the moment. That appears to be the case. 3 vehicles and fuel tanks and 1 piece of special equipment, something like electronic warfare or radar system, which is of course very useful. So that's still a problematic day for the Russians. This is the end of their much, well, ill-fated, I guess, offensive that hasn't really achieved much. Bakhmut might fall to the Russians, and if it does, it will be a Pyrrhic victory. Of that, I'm certain. So it's no surprise that perhaps the figures aren't as high as they have been, but there's still a pretty decent number of artillery and APCs that have been taken out. Right. To go along with those kind of figures, the war in Ukraine has gutted Russia's clandestine Spetsnaz forces, and it will take Moscow years to rebuild them, according to classified US assessments. Officials attributed their assessments to Russian commanders' over reliance on the specialized units. So I've been talking recently about how VDV, the airborne troops, are being used as regular troops on the front line. They've been brought into Bakhmut, into the north and south flanks to support Wagner. They are in the Kremina area. They have a TOS-1 thermobaric artillery system or piece to use, which is not the sort of thing you expect paratroopers to use, right? These are elite crack troops that come in, do a job, and then get out so that the regular troops can do their stuff. Well, actually, if they're doing the job of regular troops, some people, argue back to me, well, surely that's a good thing if you're getting really good troops to do the job of standard troops, then it means you're going to be operating better. No, you are grinding down your crack troops and using them in ways that they are not really trained to be used. You are using them in a way that you want other less well trained troops to be used, and so there's a high attrition of your much more elite forces, and that degrades your capability, really. So here, Shashant Joshi of The Economist goes on. The document shows satellite images of the 22nd Separate Spetsnaz Brigade's motor pool in southwestern Russia. Images were captured from left to right in November 2021 and November 2022, showing a depleted force following their return from Ukraine. Spetsnaz soldiers require at least 4 years of specialized training, the US documents say, concluding that it would take as long as a decade for Moscow to reconstitute these forces. Worthy of note, this is the tank Bunny, and actually I showed you footage from inside, underneath that bridge the other day of this tank being hit by a rocket. And actually there are claims that the rocket that hit it was a Ukrainian rocket, and this was a Ukrainian tank. In fact, this is a really kind of quite famous tank. So 93rd Brigade lost its captured enemy T-80 tank that was called Bunny. It was captured from the Russian army in March last year, and since then it's destroyed 6 enemy tanks. There are claims it's destroyed even more, but propaganda. In Bakhmut, it was immobilized by enemy 240 mortar fire and then destroyed by its own crew, which survived. So that could have been the mortar that hit it on the video, but they're more likely to be videoing that at the time that they were blowing it up, because they obviously knew that was going to happen. So yeah, it got pretty much stuck, immobilized, and they took it out themselves. But the Russians have been lauding this on their own sort of Telegram channels and whatnot. Sounds of shooting in temporarily occupied Melitopol, so actual shooting sounds, as opposed to just you know ordnance hitting Melitopol. So if you've got, I mean, that could be shooting at drones. You just don't know, because there were explosions afterwards or throughout the night. Another explosion was heard in northern Melitopol this morning. It seems to be near the airfield in the northern suburbs where Russia has a lot of military equipment. The occupiers say it was just a gas cylinder exploding at a domestic property. Of course it was. Melitopol has been under quite a lot of pressure from Ukrainian missiles and whatnot. Um, Now, I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about fires. Someone sort of argued back at me yesterday, why are you showing so much imagery of fires happening in Russia? Is this really anything to do with the war? Is this blah blah blah? And I don't think they're necessarily like a pro-Russian voice, just being skeptical. Russia is burning. Who or what is behind the fires? This is a really recent piece, April the 10th, from Forbes, that actually says in January, an analysis of the number of fires, major fires, this is major fires breaking out in Russia, noting particularly that the rate of fires went up 26% in both November and December, suggesting an exponential rate of increase. Um, so Yes, so a January analysis has shown that the fires have gone up a quarter in those months by 26%. But the Russian media are either omitting important details or downplaying the extent of the damage when they report them. There's a really overt media um, tendency to not report how serious these fires are within Russia, and you can understand that. New report confirms that the number of fires is continuing to increase sharply. The first 3 months of 2023 saw 212 fires compared to 414 for the whole of 2022. So actually, that would be 212 fires in the first 3 months. So if you multiplied that by four, you would get 848, which is double. So that is 100% increase. So it's not just 26%. That's a 100% increase. So 26% last year for November and December, but for the first 3 months of this year, that's a 100% increase on fires. And bear in mind that's on 2022 numbers, and the argument is the 2022 numbers are already inflated. So in other words, the first 3 months of this year are even more than 100% higher than, say, 2021, which is where we should be comparing statistics. So actually, this is a major problem. Molfa, who's doing this research, found that the most common facilities to burn were warehouses, factories, and shopping centres, as well as oil and gas storage and pipelines. Some of the fires were in military installations, including the workshop of an arms company and an ammunition warehouse in Belgorod, but most had no obvious connection to the military. The fires are most densely concentrated in Moscow, which saw 40 of the 414 fires last year, or about 10%. This trend has intensified with 35 of the 212 this year, so that's over 16%, being in Moscow, including 20 warehouses and 6 factories. 20 warehouses and 6 factories burning in 3 months in Moscow. And I don't know of stories in London of any warehouses burning, because that's the sort of thing we see on the news. So it's an incredible statistic there. There is talk about potentially a black box system. No one quite knows what that is, but it is something that's been developed that could be being given to people in Russia as a way of starting fires from a distance. Not 100% sure. Russian news media typically report the fires and explosions behind their lines as a result of careless cigarette smoking, a tendency mocked by Ukraine, leading to jokes about Ukraine's HIMARS, high mobility artillery cigarette system. Anyway, this is a major problem, and I do report these fires because I think they are creating an issue for Russia financially, economically, and in terms of pipelines and military warehouses, gas facilities. Then this is that there will be ramifications to those fires for sure. Anyway, moving on to, goodness me, there's so much to talk about today, and trigger warning, I am going to get triggered and probably rants at some point fairly soon. So apologies. Sorry, not sorry. Right. The biggest piece of news that's everywhere at the moment is Pentagon leaks. U.S. National Guardsman 21 has been identified as a subject. So Jack Teixeira led Thug Shaker Central online group and is facing arrest in Massachusetts. In fact, there's video footage, drone footage of him being arrested. So he has been, being taken in by FBI, as it says, pointing their rifles at him, so on and so forth. I'm pretty sure the writing was on the wall for him. He probably was waiting for that. Now, lots is being written about him. Uh, he was using the JWIX system, which was one of the networks used by Chelsea Manning in Iraq, to mine documents for the 2010 disclosure to WikiLeaks. He had access to highly classified military intelligence through a Defense Department computer network known as the Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communication System, said a US official familiar with the matter. Now, I don't. Well, let's just have a little look at what Tendar says here. So, one of the sources I use, my opinion, and bear in mind this is just his opinion regarding the so-called Discord leaks. Well, that picture, which is below, almost everything has been more or less known before, sometimes even more accurately assessed by open source intelligence sources. The disposition map is even a lazy knockoff of ISW. Hell, even I sometimes withhold maps because I don't want to disclose too much. I've said this before. I say the UK intelligence is often just repeating their daily report is often just repeating stuff on Twitter. OSINT is already out there, and in fact, uh, you know, a lot of the figures that are compiled, those figures in those documents were basically ISW figures. So arguably the information was already out there. So despite being apparently genuine, it is the most underwhelming information leak I saw. The intelligence assessments range from mediocre to outright wrong. For example, Bakhmut encircling imminent, and that was 7 weeks ago. The leaker also didn't do it for political reasons or money, but to nurture his petty need of recognition. So this is true, it appears. This also explains why these selected information leaks were weird or casual. It didn't make sense and justifiably made many suspicious. Absolutely dumb for the leaker. He won't see the sun without bars for the rest of his life. Nevertheless, US intelligence community should seriously update their processes. Yeah, a lot of people are saying this. Clearance level shouldn't be everything. Why an airman and the National Guard in Massachusetts needs access to intelligence assessments of Ukraine? Ever heard of Need to Know? I admit that I didn't read all the pages, so I do not exclude that bombshells might still appear, but from what I saw until now, yawn. And I think there is this idea that, yeah, as bad as these leaks are, actually they are fairly low level. I mean, there are some interesting comments about the disposition of forces and equipment, and there were the big worries about the lack of air defense systems. But actually, that there are some arguments against that I presented the other day. So uh, it's bad, but it's not as bad as it really could have been. Okay, now talking about the sorts of people who were in this group and sharing the information, some industrious NAFO fellas found the Discord post of Looker, one of the early publicists of Jack Teixeira's leaks. As you can see, it's a sewer of anti-Semitism, Holocaust jokes, racism, bigotry, including against Ukrainians. Quite the cohort here. So these guys were actually, to some degree, anti-Ukrainian and pretty unsavory bunch. If now this is right, this is where I'm going to start getting a bit angry. And my first port of call is anger at Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a Republican lawmaker, a congresswoman from Georgia. As this source says, I challenge you to name someone more stupid as NTG. I'll wait. So she has said very publicly, Jake Teixeira is white, male, Christian, and anti-war. Interestingly, anti-war being in the armed services. That makes him an enemy to the Biden regime. So basically, she's saying Biden is anti-white, anti-male, anti-Christian, and anti-war. And he told the truth about troops being on the ground in Ukraine and a lot more. Well, actually, there was a leak about special forces. Now, they could well be just in the embassies, as many people are saying. And the official line is they were just working in the embassies, and that's the same throughout the world, right? Or they're behind the lines doing a bit of training, bit of ISR, surveillance or whatnot. The fact is that every Republican government and Democrat government since the forever has done the same. Like this is that's not troops on the ground. That's not fighting troops. That's not your infantry. It's just And she says, ask yourself who is a real enemy. And right, this is where I'm going to start my ranting. Right, the enemy of the US is someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying this. You're the enemy of the US. The US government is doing everything it can, and possibly not even enough to help the rule of law, to help countries stand up for democratic rights against the oppression of Soviet Union era thinking of the Russian Federation, of the KGB agent in charge of the Russian Federation, right? And if you don't fight against that, against these people who are beheading, who are doing X, who are doing Y, committing 70,000 plus war crimes, if you don't fight against that, right, then you are the enemy. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, you are the enemy here. And you're the enemy of the US, and you're the enemy of all the things that the US is trying to stand up for. Oh, it makes me so angry. So she continues, ask yourself who is a real enemy. A young, low-level National Guardsman? Well, actually, in this case, yes. Or the administration that is waging war in Ukraine. It's not waging war, it is defending Ukraine against the aggressors. A non-NATO nation against nuclear Russia without war powers. So basically, you should just, it's a nuclear power, just let it do what it wants. Is that what you're saying, Marjorie Taylor Greene? It's a nuclear power. Oh my goodness, what are we doing standing up for the victims of oppression from the nuclear power? It's got nuclear weapons. We should do nothing. Just let the bully win here. So the moral of the story is always let the bully win if they've got a really big weapon. No one do anything. I am so angry with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I don't care if you're a big fan of hers. You need to take stock and think, like, if you are supporting the US and the allies in the Ukraine war, if you're supporting Ukraine, you cannot support rhetoric like this from Marjorie Taylor Greene. And actually, it's pretty dodgy. So there's an awful lot of fallout going on with Tucker Carlson. I don't want to go along party political lines in the US here, because there's an awful lot of Republicans. There's an awful lot of really great Republicans on my threads who are supporting the right side here, and hopefully the majority, the overwhelming majority. But when you've got mouthpieces like Tucker Carlson basically saying what Marjorie Taylor Greene's saying and calling Jack Teixeira a whistleblower. So he's now giving him some kind of hero worship, talking about that the US are having direct combatants in Ukraine. American soldiers are fighting Russian soldiers, he is saying. No, they are not. That is simply incorrect. And for you to sit on Fox News, which has the biggest viewership in America, and say that stuff is utterly disingenuous. And actually, you should be reprimanded for doing that. You should absolutely be reprimanded, because that is disinformation. And it's at odds with what was said even on Fox News hours prior. So the United States is a direct combatant in a war against Russia. As we speak, American soldiers are fighting Russian soldiers, Carlson claimed. This is a hot war between the two primary nuclear superpowers on Earth, and yet this war has never been formally declared. It's not been authorized by Congress, and for that reason, this war is a violation of American law. It's a crime. And then Tucker Carlson defended Teixeira in no uncertain terms during the broadcast, repeatedly referring to the 21-year-old as a kid and suggesting that he should be celebrated as a whistleblower. I really, really want to get. I'm going to stop now, because it's genuinely making me angry. I would love to have a conversation with Tucker Carlson. My goodness. And then the idea that I love it when people like Marjorie Taylor Greene always bang on about identity politics. Oh, you on the left, you're always talking about identity politics. Cancel culture, identity. And then they lead with identity. They lead with identity here. Jack Teixeira is white, male, Christian, and anti-American, says Denver Riggleman in reply. That makes him an enemy to the US, including those that are white, male, and Christian. Race and religion aren't the issue. Breaking an oath and helping our enemies are the issues. You should be removed from the Committee on Homeland Security, Marjorie Taylor Greene, says Denver Riggleman. So this is and he is indeed former VA rep, US Air Force Intelligence, NSA, Data Hawk, whiskey distiller, so on and so forth. So it's just annoying that there's a bunch of hypocrisy here, and the important points I guess really are that and I did label him. He's been labeled, this guy, as as a gun lover, um, uh, conservative Christian, all these things by the media. So there is lots of people jumping on labeling here, and I had a conversation with someone in my threads yesterday about this. So he is being labeled for different agendas, but the idea that, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene here is stoking, and it is not useful, and she is being counterproductive to the aims and outcomes of the US in this war. Right, to go on to something a little bit different. This is referring to the beheading of the Ukrainian POW. As you can imagine, the Russian propagandists on Russian television are saying stuff that you can imagine they're going to be saying, which is not to say this is horrible, not to condemn it, but to kind of say, hey, you know, I'm not going to condemn it, and this sort of happens in war, and that kind of apologism. So RT's former director of broadcasting, Anton Krasovsky, who previously suggested drowning Ukrainian children and burning Ukrainians in their homes, so you can imagine what he's going to be saying, responds to the head-cutting video, refuses to condemn the act, and brings up the first Chechen war. Just so much here from Julie Davis and others for documenting so much here of her documenting the propagandists and what they say. It's just pretty horrific apologism for horrific acts and war crimes. Anyway, let's move on to military aid and other such things. So the Polish Prime Minister has confirmed on April the 13th, yesterday, that Poland would supply Ukraine with more MiG-29 jets. I think there's about 20 at the moment that Poland and Slovakia together have given across. There were more that it could have given across. I don't know whether this is over and above what they've previously hinted at, or whether this is just fulfilling the whole amount and just upping what they've already given to fulfill that whole amount. I'm not entirely sure, but more MiG-29s is definitely a good thing for Ukraine. As I mentioned yesterday, this doesn't give them extra capability. To get extra capability and some kind of advantage over the Russians, they need NATO jets, not these older MiG-29s, but still useful. Now, Turkish Cobra 2 4x4 armored vehicles, around 30 of these on a train going through Romania from Turkey to Ukraine. What's interesting about this is Turkey does a really very, I guess, clever job of straddling the fence, of talking out both sides of the mouth here, trying to appease Russia in some ways, but at the same time actually giving quite a lot of equipment to Ukraine. They've given a load of Kirpis, hedgehogs, so MRAPs. These are Cobra 4x4 armored vehicles, and that is going to be very useful. They're going to be used in the upcoming counteroffensive, no doubt. And Turkey, for what they say in public, for what Erdogan says in public, are actually at times doing quite a good job at helping out Ukraine. So playing both sides perhaps, but I think more significantly supporting the war efforts of Ukraine against the war efforts of Russia. So I think where they want to do like economic things with Russia in terms of maybe energy and trade, actually supporting the military efforts of either side, I think they are overwhelmingly supporting the Ukrainians. But correct me if I'm wrong. The US Striker APC, which can actually be a sort of IFE depending on what's put on top of it. It can have some decent weaponry on top of it. But this is the Striker APC. It's now seen in Ukraine here in the service of the Ukrainian army. So it's good to see them filtering through. We've got a Czech supplied Mi-24. This is a Hind. I remember playing Gunship 2000, a computer game in the early 90s when I was in an Apache gunship taking out Hind helicopters. So the Mi-24 is a Hind. This is its other name is a Hind. So anyway, this is being these have been some of these have been supplied by the Czechs. They supplied a bunch of extra Mi-24. We've had a number of the countries in the area supplying Mi-24s, Mi-8s, and other these sorts of helicopters to Ukraine. We've had the UK supply 3 Sea Kings. These are the same kind of era helicopters, more for transportation. But actually, there's a really interesting BBC article I'm going to share with you on the Sea Kings being provided. So for those UK citizens out there that are interested in what the UK has been doing in terms of such equipment, there is that. But we just don't have enough of these even older offensive equipment, I think, in our warehouses anymore to help the Ukrainians as much as I guess we would like. The Swiss government pledges an additional $1.7 billion to Ukraine in long-term aid. The Swiss government will provide Ukraine with another 1.7 billion in financial aid between 2025 and 2028, which is good news. The Swiss have been under a lot of pressure to help militarily, but as a neutral nation, they are unable to do so. And I've been talking about compartmentalizing help, which is to say, okay, you're neutral, you're never going to help produce Gepard ammunition and do this and that. You can be responsible for providing this kind of aid, financial aid in this sector. You can be responsible. You don't have much ammunition. You don't have many pieces of military equipment as a country, so you can help with, I don't know, electricity generators and stuff like that. And when you start specializing in the aid that you give, actually, as a whole, everyone gives. Ukraine gets what it needs. So rather than slag off certain countries, you say, okay, you're not going to do that. How about doing this? And then we don't have to do this, and we'll do that. So hopefully that kind of agreement will take place. The United States is considering using the frozen assets of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation to restore Ukraine, said US Deputy Secretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland. They are kept on accounts in foreign banks and total about $300 billion. Yep, go for it. Sounds good to me. For the Russians, they plan to mass produce Kh-50 cruise missiles, which may indicate the possibility of intensifying missile strikes against Ukraine this autumn. That's according to Ukraine's general staff. Now, Russia have also been calling out to China for one of the chemicals needed in such munitions, in explosives. They are short on that chemical, and that indicates that they would struggle to make weapons like these. It's whether China will actually provide that for Russia. Pro-Russian channels are now claiming that T-55 is in Ukraine, and this old tank has been indeed sent to the front rather than being dismantled or cannibalized or whatnot. It is being sent to the front to be used in warfare. And more than 300 ships are currently under construction in Russia, but they cannot be completed due to the action of sanctions mechanisms. This was announced on April the 13th by the Deputy General Director of the Kerr Central Scientific Research Institute. Now, I don't know if all of these ships are military. I'd be incredibly, hugely doubtful of that. But there is definitely an impact of sanctions on the construction, in this case, of ships. Russia is in trouble in terms of its ability to maintain fleets, to build missiles, to build all sorts of things, and that pressure needs to be kept up. And there's a lot of talk about trying to close down loopholes. So sanctions, further sanctions, because the EU and the US have pretty much exhausted most of their sanction options. Now most of the sanctions are about, right, you've got used to this sanction and you've got around it by doing that. So we're going to put a sanction that's here to stop you exploiting loopholes. And I think we'll see a lot more of that. Right, let's talk geopolitics. German imports are down from Russia over 90% in the war's first year. So the Federal Statistical Office said Germany imported goods worth 300 million euros, $329 million in February, down from 3.7 billion euros a year earlier. Wow. That was a 91% fall and dropped Russia from the 11th biggest source of imports to 46th place. So that is incredible. Not only is that going to be a boon for anyone providing whatever Russia would be providing, in this case, mainly going to be uh, hydrocarbons, I'm sure, but Russia, they're gonna be reeling because they're gonna have to find that market elsewhere and probably at a lower price. The statistics office said imports of Russian oil and gas were down 99.8% in the year to February, falling to 4.2 million euros from 2.2 billion euros. Germany's overall imports of oil and gas this February totaled 6 billion euros. Coal imports dropped 92.5% to 26 million euros from 347 million euros. Meanwhile, Germany exported goods to the tune of 800 million euros to Russia in February, down from 2.1 billion euros a year earlier. That was a 60.5% decline. Incredible statistics there. And then Germany was particularly reliant on Russia, certainly in the energy sector. But yeah, that's going to have a huge effect on the Russians there. Now, this is something that is liable to trigger me again. Exxon CEO's pay rise rose 52% to nearly £30 million. So this is a British press release or British article, so it's in pounds. Amid Ukraine war, figures show. Right, ExxonMobil handed its chief executive a 52% pay increase to $35.9 million for 2022. That's £28.7 million after the oil company reported its highest ever profits amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Who pays for that profit? Oh yeah, you and I. You and I pay for that profit. Like that comes out of either our we're paying for that in direct energy costs, or everything we buy, the price has gone up. Inflation, because the cost of the energy to make those things has gone up. So money, profits don't come from nowhere. That profit comes from us. So when we are struggling to pay for our energy bills, when we've had a cost of living crisis in the UK, and the people who are running these companies are making billions of quid off the back of our like difficulties, then I get angry because that's economics without morality. Darren Woods' salary rose by 10% to $1.9 million last year, while his bonus and share awards surged by 80% compared with the year before. The company said the bumper payday was, quote, reflective of record company earnings and stock price performance. Awesome. ExxonMobil made $56 billion in profits, or $6.3 million an hour. Last year, by the time I've recorded this, they would have made about $4 million in profit. Last year, after the war in Ukraine ignited a surge in global oil and gas prices, the company's record profit was also the highest reported by any Western oil company. But its main US rival, Chevron, had a record $36.5 billion profit, while the European oil company Shell announced the biggest profits in its 115-year history at $39.9 billion, and BP reported a $27.7 billion profit. Chief executive of BP, Bernard Looney, outraged critics after taking home about £10 million last year, a 120% increase from the $4.5 million he received in 2021. It was called a kick in the teeth to households struggling with their energy bills by campaigns at Global Witness. Now, this is at the same time that the US Ofgem, the regulator for the energy industry, had to create a pool of money to help people who couldn't afford their energy bills, like a charitable pool of money. What creating charity from different places, while the guy that is raking profits off the back of that increase in fuel costs, energy costs, is taking home record profits. There's charity having to be given out to people who couldn't afford to heat their homes. The oil industry's outsized and remember, BP, their own treasurer, last year said, quote, "We have more money than we know what to do with." I know what you could do with it. Charge less to the consumer, or to the consumer of your products. That's a good start. The oil industry's outsized profits were criticized as outrageous by the US President Joe Biden during his State of the Union address in February. Biden had previously accused Exxon of making more money than God. Right, on to another thing that annoys me. Ukrainian orchestra's key members refuse visas to play in the UK. Now, these shows were promoted by the UK government on their website as an example of British-Ukrainian relations. After the orchestra played the Harry Potter show in Belgium last year, the Deputy British Ambassador in Brussels, Chloe Lauter, hailed it as an incredible honour to have such an iconic part of British culture being performed by a Ukrainian orchestra. Yeah, fantastic, apart from we didn't give them visas. In fact, we've been really bad at giving Ukrainians visas. A lot to do with the fact that we're not in Europe anymore, and the whole visa thing to do with internal travel within Europe versus into Britain. And in fact, this has affected, I don't know if people have been keeping an eye on Brexit particularly, but one of the big issues for post-Brexit UK is the music industry. I'm a big music fan, and basically bands are less able to travel into Europe, into the UK to perform, and UK bands are really struggling to perform around Europe without a whole load of extra costs and red tape, etc., etc. So, this article talks to that. So it could be related to the Brexit issues to do with the visas in the music industry. I'm not 100% sure, but that seems pretty ridiculous. That here we are trying to celebrate Ukrainian culture and how wonderful and how close a relationship we've got with Ukraine. You want to come and play your orchestral music here. Yeah, brilliant. Oh, we're not going to give you visas. Yeah, sorry about that. Oh, so the organisers then lose £88,000 as a result of that. So it just annoying. Don't underestimate the efforts that Russia will make with its powers globally to get around the sanctions. They're affecting the Russian economy. They're affecting the Russian war machine. Mary McGuinness, the EU Commissioner for Financial Stability, has said exactly what I was talking about earlier. They're putting things in place to stop the Russia getting around the sanctions to exploit the loopholes. Norway has expelled 15 Russian intelligence officers from its embassy. Scare quotes, diplomats. Yesterday, Norway expelled 15 Russian embassy officials that the foreign ministry said on Thursday were intelligence officers operating under the cover of diplomatic positions, the latest such expulsion by Western nations since Moscow invaded Ukraine. Mikhailo Fedorov, urged Apple and Spotify to block Russian music. This is something that I need to have a little think about, actually. Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov stressed that Russian show business continued to earn billions, which are then converted into rockets. Now, do you hit individual artists who are just Russian and stop them being able to make money as part of sanctions, but we sanction other forms of industry? So there's a really interesting discussion. I need to think about that, actually. But interesting that he's calling for Spotify, for the music industry, to clamp down on Russian artists. Okay, moving along to Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine have signed a cooperation agreements after a trilateral meeting on ways to strengthen security in their Black Sea region to counter threats posed by Russia's aggression. This is where you're going to see nations that Russia wants a lot of influence in, perhaps becoming closer to each other, and this being a kick in the teeth for Russia. This is the opposite of what Russia wanted to happen in the region. Russia didn't want NATO expansionism, and I'm going to comment on that in my extra. Because it turns out that they have got NATO expansionism, but they haven't got particularly angry about Finland. Nothing's been said about Finland joining NATO, which means that this whole war, we're doing this war because of NATO expansionism. Well, we've had NATO expansionism, and you didn't even bat an eyelid. So it really wasn't about NATO expansion. It was about Russian imperialism. Anyway, I'm going to rant again, so come on, move on. Moldova's top pro-Kremlin politician sentenced to 15 years in prison. Moldova's pro-Kremlin politician, Ilan Shor, has been sentenced to 15 years for fraud and money laundering. Now, he has also lost all his property, valued at around $250 million, according to the final decision of the appeal court. Shaw is thought to be in Israel, so he was sentenced in absentia. Viktor Orban's political allies in Hungary are in the sights of US sanctions. This is, I think, we need to watch this one. Congress group drafts legislation targeting officials and government supporters mainly affiliated with the Fidesz party. So this is a party that is causing so much problem for the EU, as Viktor Orban is becoming more and more dictatorial, more autocratic, and shutting down independent judges and the legal system. He's bending the legal system to his will, as well as shutting down freedom of press in the country and all the kind of things that dictators do. He's been doing there for some years, and his Fidesz party is largely behind that. For them, or people involved with that party and people involved with Orban, to be targeted by sanctions might mean you might get a bit of a volte-face for the Fidesz party, for Orban, if they follow the money and know which side their bread is buttered, or they might stand up against that. So it could go either way. But we have seen recently Orban and some of the Hungarian diplomats change their tune on the war and their rhetoric. So Hungary to cease cooperation, as we can see here, with Russian-owned bank after sanctions. Hungary will cease cooperation with the Russia-owned International Investment Bank following sanctions imposed on the financial institution by the US Treasury. Business news outlet Vlagazdag reported. Sorry, words are difficult today. Vlagazdag. There you go. Easy. Slovakia becomes next EU member state to restrict Ukrainian grain imports. We've heard recently that Polish farmers have got up in arms about cheap Ukrainian grain going over the border, which is then doing them out of their livelihood. So there have been these kind of big protests against Ukrainian grain. I don't know whether that's because Ukrainian grain is unable to be shipped around the world as easily. So there's maybe more grain locally that is now cheaper, that can flood the markets. I'm not 100% sure. I need to look into that. But Slovakia's agricultural ministry has banned Ukrainian grain from its markets on April 13th over pesticides found in the grain that are prohibited in the EU. And that may well be true, but I don't know whether that's a cover-up for actually not wanting Ukrainian grain to do exactly what the problem that was seen in Poland, in Slovakia. So I don't know. Again, I need to look into that. But there's the news today. Sorry, it was quite a long one. Too much ranting from me. Please like, subscribe, and share. Toodle pips, and I'll speak to you later.